price of substitute goods. Now, I want you to sort of hold in your mind that idea of demand and demand shifting and put it in one part of your brain and now talk about supply. Well, if we've got supply, we're going to talk about it in a similar way. When economists speak of supply for a good, they're referring to the relationship between quantity supplied and the price of that good. Specifically, the relationship is as the price of the good goes up, the quantity supplied of that good tends to go up too. And again, this should make some intuitive sense to you. As the price gets higher and higher, firms become much more willing to supply what that good is. You can visualize this on a graph. Again, it would be a graph with the quantity of the good on the horizontal axis, the price on the vertical axis, and the supply curve slopes up. That essentially means a higher price means more and more is going to be supplied. Now, why is that? Why does a higher price lead to a higher quantity supplied? Well, there's essentially two reasons. One is just that existing firms want to produce more as the price goes up and up. And of course, the other reason is that new firms might decide to enter the market if the price of the good they're selling goes up and up too. Now, just as there's often a confusion between demand and quantity demanded, there's a parallel confusion between supply and quantity supplied. The quantity supplied refers to the specific amounts produced at a given price. Supply refers to how much is produced at every price. Quantity supplied is a point, a quantity, and a supply curve is a relationship between price and quantity supplied. So again, here's our trick question one more time, right? The trick question is, what makes supply rise or fall? And if your answer is price, you're wrong. Because price doesn't move supply. Price causes the quantity supplied to change, but it doesn't shift the entire supply relationship. For supply to increase, the whole supply relationship has to move, so that at every given price, a larger quantity will be supplied. Conversely, for supply to fall, it has to be that at every given price, a smaller quantity is supplied. Now, what kind of things would move supply in this way? One would be a change in technology. For example, a cheaper way of producing could mean a greater quantity is going to be supplied of a certain good at every given price. Another thing might be weather. For a lot of products like agriculture, better weather means that more will be supplied at every given price, and worse weather could mean less will be supplied at every given price. Another factor would be input prices. If a firm uses a lot of oil or a lot of steel, and the price of the input goes up, then the quantity supplied at every given price is going to fall. Now, we want to take these two ideas of supply and demand and put them together at the same time in your brain. The easiest way to do that, I think, is start off by thinking about a really low price. At a really low price, the quantity supplied is pretty low because nobody wants to produce at a low price. But the quantity demanded might be really high because everyone wants to buy at a low price. Now, as the price begins to go up a little bit, the quantity supplied begins to increase. It's better for firms to produce, but the quantity demanded begins to drop off as people are discouraged from buying. And so as that quantity supplied rises and rises, and that quantity demanded falls and falls, at some point, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. And that point is called the equilibrium. Now, let's think about what that equilibrium means for a moment. What would happen if price was above its equilibrium level? If price was higher than equilibrium, then firms love supplying stuff at the really high price, but people don't want to buy very much of it. So the quantity supplied is bigger than the quantity demanded. And stuff starts piling up on shelves. And to get rid of it, sellers are going to have to start cutting down their prices, and the price will slowly move down toward the equilibrium level, where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are in balance. If the price was temporarily below equilibrium, if it was temporarily low, then you're in a situation where the sellers begin thinking, if the price is so low, then why are we producing so much? Why are we producing so little? And the demanders think, oh, this is just super. So in that situation, people are lining up to buy things. People want to buy all kinds of stuff. And so as they're eager to buy things, the price begins to be driven up. Suppliers notice, hey, there are big lines of people waiting to buy things. And if there are big lines of people waiting to buy things, we can raise the price toward the equilibrium level. only if quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to each other, only if you're at equilibrium, do you get this point of balance. This point of balance where there isn't extra building up on the shelves, nor are there big lines of people waiting to buy stuff. And so equilibrium is a balancing sort of point. It's the point toward which the economy tends to go. Now, just to be clear on this, I'm not claiming markets are always at equilibrium. There's an enormous dispute going back a couple hundred years over how long it takes markets to get to equilibrium and how close they are and whether they overshoot past equilibrium and bounce back and all that. All I'm arguing is that markets are typically tending toward the direction of equilibrium. Moreover, in a special sense that economists like to use this word, the equilibrium price and quantity are efficient. And efficient in a specific economic sense, which means that nothing is being wasted. Think again about what happens if quantity demanded is not equal to quantity supplied. If the two are equal to each other, then there isn't extra stuff piling up on shelves. There's nothing being wasted in terms of extra production, nor are buyers waiting in line. There's nothing being wasted in terms of people trying to get a certain product. An efficient machine has no wasted motion, no extra parts. An efficient market has no extra products sitting around or no extra demand for products that are not there. So when we think about something being efficient and in equilibrium, we want to avoid that situation where goods are piling up on shelves without being bought. That's clearly wasteful. We want to avoid the situation where people are waiting for something and they can't get it. That would be clearly wasteful. And the equilibrium outcome will be the best outcome in terms of avoiding that kind of waste. To phrase the same idea in a little bit different way, efficiency means that every seller who's willing to take the market price can find a buyer at equilibrium, and all buyers willing to pay the market price can find a seller at equilibrium. Indeed, it sort of defines the notion that a market equilibrium is kind of a win-win situation. There's a bunch of sellers who want to sell and are willing to sell at that price. There's a bunch of buyers who want to buy. They both perceive themselves as better off in terms of their own self-interest from buying and selling. Now, any change in demand or supply will cause demand and supply relationships to shift in a way that leads to a new equilibrium point. Consider, for example, the market for beef. If income rises, then the demand for beef goes up. As demand increases, there'll be a new equilibrium, which involves people buying more beef and paying a higher price. On the other side, you can imagine, say, if there was some outbreak of cattle disease, maybe that decreases the supply of the beef that's available. And that leads to a new equilibrium with people buying less beef and at a higher price. A lot of an academic class in introductory economics is devoted to thinking through the consequences of these demand and supply shifts. The specific goods and examples change, but this basic pattern of think about demand, think about supply, start at equilibrium, think about what would happen if demand or supply shifted, think about what new price and quantity would result in the new equilibria, and tell me the answer on a quiz. The supply and demand framework is intended as a framework for discussing how prices and quantities are determined in markets and why those market prices and quantities are going to change. Now, I should emphasize here that there is no claim here that everyone is happy about the equilibrium that results. There will always be buyers who say, boy, I would love the price to be lower. I really think I'm paying too much. And there will always be sellers who say, I can't believe it's selling fat. I would like the price to be higher. Equilibrium only means that quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to each other. It doesn't mean anything about how everyone will say, wow, I sure am grateful and happy that everything is at equilibrium. That's just not what it means. In fact, many people will go to the government, even when the market is at equilibrium, and lobby for laws that will change that outcome. There will always be buyers who would like the price to be lower. There will always be sellers who would like the price to be higher. And they're going to go to the government and they're going to complain. In the next lecture, we'll talk about some of the consequences of that behavior. Another complaint that's often made about this supply and demand model is that people say real people don't think this way. This may make sense to you, but real people don't think this way. So how can that conceivably be a way that describes how the economy works? Well, that's actually a deep and a sophisticated question. I should say, first of all, this is not intended to be a literal description of how people think. But even if it was intended to be a literal description, it may be closer to reality than you at first think. For example, economists like to say, businesses definitely think this way. How do we know businesses think this way? It's because the managers of those businesses had to take economics in business school. So they think this way. They were trained to think this way. If you think about the individual behavior of consumers, it's reasonable to think that most people consider their desires, they consider what are the other options they could substitute, they consider how much money they've got, and they consider their own self-interest when they try and buy something. Well, that's precisely what I'm talking about here. That's precisely what demand is. Just that people thoughtfully sit down and try and contemplate what the possibilities are, and then they go out and buy accordingly. It's reasonable to think that most people consider their own desires and the amount of money that they've got on hand. And as long as that's reasonable, this model is reasonable too. Now, of course, most people don't walk out there with supply and demand curves and all of these relationships in mind. But if people look for the goods they prefer at the lowest possible price, and if firms adjust their production in response to changes in price, then people and firms are acting according to supply and demand. It's also true, as economists have long pointed out, that when there's a model of behavior, it doesn't have to be exactly identical to how people think. Imagine, for example, that you were trying to predict the speed and the arc of a pass from a football quarterback to a receiver. So you would use all these equations. You would use equations from physics about the weight of the ball and the force of gravity and the speed of the wind and all that kind of stuff. Now, a quarterback who throws a football doesn't know any of those equations, but they keep accurately throwing the ball over and over and over, accurately to where they want to. Similarly, economists believe that this idea of supply and demand captures what firms and people actually do, just in the same way that equations of physics capture what a quarterback does, even if it doesn't capture the thought process of what's happening. A supply and demand framework is an extraordinarily useful way of thinking about why prices are at the levels that they are, and why the prices might be rising or falling. It's an explanation that works for all sorts of products in markets all over the world at all different times of history. A lot of the complaints about markets and how they work, people don't like it that the prices for some things are high or low. They don't like the distribution of income, poor and rich. They might not like some of what is produced, fatty food, junk television. They don't like thinking about people are being selfish. I am not claiming in any way that any of this is likable or morally attractive or humanly desirable in some deep philosophical sense. I am only claiming that supply and demand is useful. It is a useful and powerful way of describing and understanding what actually happens, what actually determines the prices and outputs of goods. And as a useful mechanism, it applies extremely well across countries, across different goods, and across history.